He is the 18th king of Rohan, a man whose youth would be defined by loss and unwavering loyalty, a man whose reign would be defined by friendship and love between his realm and Gondor. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the life of Éomer. Éomer is born in 2991 of the Third Age, to his father, Éomund, and mother, Theoden, the sister of King Theoden. It is likely that Éomer was born in the city of Aldburg, in the Fold region of Rohan. This is where his father was stationed as First Marshal of the Riddermark, the highest military rank in Rohan, tasked with commanding the muster of the Rohirrim. When Éomer is 4 years old, Éomund and Theoden have a daughter, Eowyn. Yet it was in these early years of their lives that the shadow of Mordor reached out to Rohan. Orcs began raiding the eastern regions, slaying and stealing horses from Rohan. Meanwhile, other orcs would come down from the Misty Mountains. Many of these were Uruks in the service of Saruman, though nobody suspected this at the time. Being a great lover of horses and hater of orcs, it is said Éomund would receive news of a raid and would ride against the orcs in hot anger, unwarily, and with few men. One day, in 3002, Éomund pursues a small band of orcs to the borders of the Emyn Muil. Sadly, there was a stronger force lying in wait among the rocks, and ambushing the Rohirrim, they kill Éomund. Not long after this, his wife Theoden falls ill and dies. A grieving Theoden, himself a widower, takes Éomer, now 11, and Eowyn, now 7, into his own house, calling them son and daughter alongside his own son, Theodred, who was then 24 years old. Éomer and his sister would grow up in Edoras, and he would grow to be a tall, strong, and valiant warrior. Hammond and Skull's Reader's Companion to The Lord of the Rings puts Éomer at around 6 feet 6 inches tall. As his father before him, Éomer serves as Marshal of the Riddermark, though he would hold the title of Third Marshal. Theoden himself would serve as First Marshal, with his son Theodred acting as Second Marshal. Unfortunately, Éomer and his cousin would face greater threats than orc raids during their days. The king's advisor, Grima Wormtongue, would ally in secret with Saruman. Through his words and poison, Grima works to undermine Theodred and Éomer and weaken the king. Despite Wormtongue having some measure of success in turning Theoden against Éomer, Éomer's loyalty would never waver. Wormtongue would also seek to turn Theodred and Éomer against one another, an effort that would fail, for they regarded one another as brothers. One day in the summer of 3018, Boromir of Gondor passed through Rohan, on his way north seeking Rivendell. Éomer and the Rohirrim would lend Boromir a horse to use on his journey, though the steed would come back riderless, and they would have no word of Boromir until the following year. A few months after Boromir's travels through their lands, Saruman's orcs, wargs, and Dunlendings would openly make war upon Rohan. The White Wizard claims lordship over their lands and makes the Gap of Rohan impassable. Knowing that Theodred and Éomer are the chief foils to his plans, Saruman launches an attack upon the Rohirrim in the Battle of the Fords of Isen on February 25, 3019. To his Urukai, he gives a single order: kill the king's son at all costs. Tragically, Theodred would fall in the battle at the age of 41. The following day, Éomer receives word of a company of orcs entering Rohan from the Emyn Muil, the very location of his father's death. Believing this to be a sign of an alliance between Sauron and Saruman, Éomer wishes to hunt down this orc force. However, at the behest of Grima, Theoden would forbid his nephew from moving against the orcs, saying that it would leave Edoras unguarded. However, Éomer, suspecting Grima to be a traitor, leaves around midnight of February 27th with his division. Near the end of February 28th, they spot the orcs near the borders of Fangorn Forest. They would remain watchful of the orcs from a distance. Another group of orcs from Isengard, under their leader Mahur, makes their way from the west, seeking the group who, unbeknownst to the Rohirrim, has 2 captive hobbits with them. This second company is defeated by the Rohirrim, and the next morning Éomer leads his riders in attacking the first. Éomer and his company utterly destroy the orcs, and Éomer himself kills Ugluk, their cruel leader. In the battle, Éomer loses 15 of his men and 12 of their horses. The deceased Rohirrim would be buried in a mound, around which the men would place 15 spears, 1 for each of the fallen. As for the Uruks, the Rohirrim would pile their corpses upon the battlefield and burn them. Unbeknownst to Éomer, their attack allowed Merry and Pippin to escape their captivity, fleeing into Fangorn Forest. With their enemies destroyed, Éomer leads his people back toward Edoras. However, they would come across a most unexpected trio, a man, an elf, and a dwarf, traveling through their lands. In their ensuing conversation, he would discover that they had been through Lorien. "Then there is a lady in the Golden Wood, as old tales tell," he said. "Few escape her nets, they say. These are strange days. But if you have her favor, then you also are net weavers and sorcerers, maybe." Gimli, who isn't one to tolerate insults toward Lady Galadriel, rises and plants his feet firmly apart, hand gripped upon the handle of his axe, and his dark eyes flashed. He demands Éomer's name and threatens to give him more than his own in return. While a fight nearly breaks out, Aragorn intervenes, revealing his true name and showing Éomer the sword reforged. Aragorn goes on to tell of their remarkable journey pursuing the orcs carrying Merry and Pippin, covering some 135 miles in less than 4 full days. In amazement, Éomer declares that rather than Strider, Aragorn should be called Wingfoot. Éomer reveals all that transpired between the Rohirrim and the orcs, saying there was little hope to find their halflings alive. The Marshal of the Mark wishes the trio to accompany him back to Edoras and aid Rohan in their time of need. Yet Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli would insist on searching for the hobbits. Éomer would give to the 3 companions 2 horses whose riders had died in the battle with the Uruks, Hasufel and Arod. He only asked that they be returned to Edoras when they had finished their search. With this, Éomer and his riders resume their ride back to Edoras. Upon their return, Éomer is confronted in the king's court for riding out against the king's orders, and for not bringing back the 3 travelers trespassing in Rohan. Éomer threatens to kill Grima, and Grima has Éomer arrested. Éomer would be stripped of his armor and weapons and imprisoned for the next 2 days. On March 2nd, the 3 hunters, now accompanied by Gandalf the White, come to the Golden Hall. Grima is confronted, his treachery revealed, and Theoden healed. "Your fingers would remember their old strength better if they grasped a sword hilt," said Gandalf. Theoden rose and put his hand to his side, but no sword hung at his belt. "Where has Grima stowed it?" he muttered under his breath. "Take this, dear lord," said a clear voice. "It was ever at your service." 2 men had come softly up the stair and stood now a few steps from the top. Éomer was there. No helm was on his head, no mail was on his breast, but in his hand he held a drawn sword, and as he knelt, he offered the hilt to his master. "How comes this?" said Theoden sternly. He turned towards Éomer, and the men looked in wonder at him, standing now proud and erect. Where was the old man whom they had left crouching in his chair or leaning on his stick? "It is my doing, lord," said Hama, trembling. "I understood that Éomer was to be set free. Such joy was in my heart that maybe I have erred. Yet since he was free again, and he a marshal of the mark, I brought him his sword as he bade me." "To lay at your feet, my lord." said Éomer. For a moment of silence, Theoden stood looking down at Éomer as he knelt still before him. Neither moved.
"Will you not take the sword?"
said Gandalf. Slowly, Theoden stretched forth his hand. As his fingers took the hilt, it seemed to the Watchers that firmness and strength returned to his thin arm. Suddenly, he lifted the blade and swung it shimmering and whistling in the air. Then he gave a great cry. His voice rang clear as he chanted in the tongue of Rohan, a call to arms.
"Arise now, arise, riders of Theoden. Dire deeds awake. Dark is it eastward. Let horse be bridled, horn be sounded. Forth, Eolingas!"
Thus Theoden is renewed, and makes to lead his Rohirrim in battle against Saruman. That very day, Éomer sets out from Edoras with his king and his new allies as they ride north. The next day, they meet a scout, Ceorl, who had been sent by Erkenbrand to warn Éomer that Saruman had unleashed his forces, and an army of some 10,000 was heading across the Isen. As Gandalf rides out to find Erkenbrand, Éomer and Theoden lead their people to Helm's Deep. Arriving that night, Éomer oversees preparations at the Hornburg as they await Saruman's army. That night, the siege of Helm's Deep begins, and when battering rams are brought to the gates, Éomer and Aragorn lead a group out through a side passage, driving back the enemy forces. During this skirmish, Gimli saves Éomer's life, killing 2 orcs who had ambushed him. Throughout the night, Éomer would lead the Rohirrim alongside Aragorn in defending Helm's Deep from the attackers. When the blasting fire of Saruman breaches the wall, the heroes are separated and forced to retreat. While Aragorn and Legolas would go to the Hornburg itself, Éomer and Gimli would be forced to retreat to the glittering caves behind the fortress. Thankfully, Gandalf the White would arrive in the morning alongside Erkenbrand and his 1,000 riders. Between the reinforcements and the Huorns of Fangorn, the Uruks are completely destroyed, and the Dunlendings surrender. Éomer would then accompany his uncle and the victorious leaders from Helm's Deep in traveling north to Isengard, where they confront Saruman. We are told that not only does Theoden not fall prey to the power of Saruman's voice, but neither does Éomer. He would then witness Gandalf break Saruman's staff, casting him from the Order of the Astari. While Gandalf and Pippin would depart the company for Minas Tirith, Éomer and the others would return to Helm's Deep, arriving on March 6th. From there, they would leave for Dunharrow. Aragorn would take a faster route, heading not only for Dunharrow, but the Paths of the Dead located there. Aragorn arrives at Dunharrow on the night of March 7th, while Éomer, Theoden, and the riders of Rohan arrive 2 days later on March 9th. At Dunharrow, Éomer would meet once more his sister Eowyn, who had been sent there with many people of Edoras when the army had set out to confront Saruman. After receiving a messenger with the red arrow from Gondor requesting their aid, Theoden resolves to ride to Minas Tirith. Éomer would ride alongside his uncle for the next 2 days, coming to the Druidan forest on March 13th. The leader of the Druidine, Ganburigan, leads the Rohirrim by a secret forest road to bypass an orc host upon the road to Gondor. The Rohirrim come to the field of Pelennor at dawn on March 15th, and as Theoden issues commands to his marshals, he tells his nephew to follow the king's banner down the center of the battlefield. The Rohirrim fight with great valor on the field of Pelennor, and they are both fell and fair. In the calamity of the battle, Éomer would next find his uncle as he lies mortally wounded. Then one of the knights took the king's banner from the hand of Gulthaf, the banner bearer who lay dead, and he lifted it up. Slowly, Theoden opened his eyes. Seeing the banner, he made a sign that it should be given to Éomer.
"Hail, King of the Mark," he said. "Ride now to victory. Bid Eowyn farewell."
And so he died, and knew not that Eowyn lay near him. And those who stood by wept, crying, "Theoden King, Theoden King." Éomer tells his men to not mourn overmuch, for war yet called to them. Yet to himself he wept, bidding Theoden's knights to remain with the king to protect his body from battle. And he looked at the slain, recalling their names. Then suddenly he beheld his sister Eowyn as she lay, and he knew her. He stood a moment as a man who is pierced in the midst of a cry by an arrow through the heart, and then his face went deathly white, and a cold fury rose in him, so that all speech failed him for a while. A fey mood took him. "Eowyn, Eowyn," he cried at last. "Eowyn, how come you here? What madness or devilry is this? Death, death, death! Death, take us all!" Then, without taking counsel or waiting for the approach of the men of the city, he spurred headlong back to the front of the great host, and blew a horn, and cried aloud for the onset. Over the field rang his clear voice, calling, "Death! Ride! Ride to ruin and the world's ending!" And with that the host began to move, but the Rohirrim sang no more. "Death," they cried with one voice loud and terrible. And gathering speed like a great tide, their battle swept about their fallen king and passed, roaring away southwards. Éomer is shocked by finding his sister seemingly slain upon a battlefield, when he believed her to be many miles away in Rohan. He and his men would fight valiantly, yet soon find themselves trapped, surrounded by their enemies. Stern now was Éomer's mood, and his mind clear again. He let blow the horns to rally all men to his banner that could come thither, for he thought to make a great shield wall at the last, and stand, and fight there on foot till all fell, and do deeds of song on the fields of Pelennor, though no man should be left in the west to remember the last king of the mark. So he rode to a green hillock, and there set his banner, and the white horse ran rippling in the wind. Out of doubt, out of dark to the day's rising, I came singing in the sun, sword unsheathing. To hope's end I rode, and to heart's breaking. Now for wrath, now for ruin, and a red nightfall. But as Éomer fights, laughing in the battle lust, king of a fell people making his last desperate stand, he sees the black-sailed ships were not captained by the corsairs. Instead, it flew the standard of the king of Gondor. Aragorn had returned. As Sauron's forces face their defeat, Éomer meets Aragorn upon the field of battle, and it is said that Éomer, Aragorn, and Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth were unscathed, for such was the fortune and the skill and the might of their arms, and few indeed dared to abide them or look on their faces in the hour of their wrath. Soon after their victory, Éomer would learn that his sister was not truly dead, and she and many others would be healed by Aragorn. There, in the houses of healing, Éomer would call to his sister, and she would finally awake at hearing his voice. In honor of his service to both Eowyn and Theoden, King Éomer makes the wounded Meriadoc Brandybuck a knight of the Riddermark. The following day, March 16th, Éomer would meet Aragorn and the other captains outside the city to debate what should be done. Gandalf advises that they should ride with a great force to the Black Gate to draw out Sauron's armies. Aragorn agrees with Gandalf's counsel, and Éomer pledges to ride with Aragorn in thanks for his aid upon the Pelennor. 2 days later, the host of the West departs Minas Tirith, making their way north to the Black Gate of Mordor. They arrive on March 25th, 3019, and would make their last stand against Sauron, knowing not whether there was any hope that Frodo would succeed, or succeed in time for them to survive. Their faith and valor was rewarded, and Éomer bore witness to the downfall of Sauron. Following this great victory of the age, the men of the West set up camp upon the field of Cormallen, in the Gondorian lands of Ithilien. There they would celebrate Frodo and Sam. The victorious host would then return to Minas Tirith, and Éomer would attend the coronation of Aragorn on May 1st. Shortly afterward, he and Aragorn would renew the Oath of Eorl, the ancient bond between Rohan and Gondor, swearing everlasting friendship between the two kingdoms. 1 week after Aragorn's coronation, Éomer and his sister would leave Minas Tirith. Traveling with Elladan and Elrohir, the twin sons of Elrond, they would make their way back to Edoras for a short time to set things in order. On June 14th, the sons of Elrond would meet their father and sister traveling south and bring them to Edoras before escorting them to Gondor 2 days later. Roughly 1 month after leaving Gondor, Éomer would return on July 18th, and there he would put to rest an old quarrel with Gimli, who had earlier said he would fight Éomer were he not to declare that Galadriel was the fairest of all. Éomer said to his eyes, she was surpassed only by Arwen, and the two, who began ready to smite one another, would be great friends forever after. The following day, July 19th, Éomer would bring Theoden's body back to Edoras, and with a great many of their friends in attendance, they would hold Theoden's funeral in Edoras on August 10th. But amid the mourning is great joy, for Eowyn and Faramir are betrothed, with Éomer stating, "Thus is the friendship of the Mark and of Gondor bound with a new bond, and the more do I rejoice." After the feast, Éomer and Eowyn would have 2 more gifts for Mary. First is a name, Holdwina, meaning loyal friend in the Rohan language, and the second is the Horn of the Mark, an heirloom of the House of Eorl, held by their people for over 1,000 years. As for Éomer himself, he would also find love. In 3021 of the Third Age, he would marry Lothiriel, the princess of Dol Amroth and daughter of Imrahil. He had met her during his time staying in Gondor, and together they would have a son, Elfwine. As king, Éomer would change the positions of second and third marshals into a marshal of the West Mark and a marshal of the East Mark. He would name Erkenbrand marshal in the west and Elfhelm in the east. It is said that Éomer in the years to come would often fulfill the oath of Eorl, riding to Aragorn's aid in battle, for many enemies would need to be fought in the east and south before the White Tree could grow in peace. Despite times of war, Éomer's reign would be one of great prosperity. He would come to be known as Éomer Eadig, meaning the Blessed, for during his rule Rohan would recover from the hurts of the War of the Ring, and once more become rich and fruitful. Not only would Rohan be great neighbors to the Gondorians to their south, but they would welcome new neighbors within their very lands. Gimli would lead a group of dwarves out of Erebor, and with the king's blessing, establish a new dwarven colony in the glittering caves behind Helm's Deep. His friendships with Gimli, Aragorn, and Meriadoc would endure for decades to come. It is said that both Éomer and Eowyn sent Merry gifts when he became Master of Buckland in the 11th year of the Fourth Age. And 52 years later, as Éomer feels his days coming to an end, he asks that the great Holdwina would visit him one last time. Merry and Pippin would both come to Rohan, staying with the king until the fall, when at the age of 93, King Éomer dies. His son would take the throne, second king of the third line. Éomer's reign would be remembered not only for its great prosperity, but for its great duration. At 65 years, he was the second longest serving king of Rohan. He would be remembered as a man of unwavering love and loyalty to his king, to his family, and to his friends. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil 19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Alvin Einbert, Jeremy Daniel Derby, Madame Director, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Z and N, Evely, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Next time on Nerd of the Rings.